The cold chamber was ready. Carl had prepared it himself 3 weeks prior, dismissing the servants with a gesture and standing alone in the room that would belong to his wife. Stone walls, a single narrow window facing north. A bed wide enough for one person to sleep without ever touching the center. He had chosen the furniture with the precision of a man building a fortress, functional, tasteful, entirely without warmth. A writing desk, a wardrobe of pale ashwood, a rug the color of winter fog. He had stood in the doorway when he was finished and felt something close to satisfaction. This was the shape of what they would be. Contained, correct, survivable. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now he stood in the throne room with his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw set in the particular way his steward called his treaty face. And he waited for the woman who would be his wife to come through the doors at the far end of the hall. The room smelled of beeswax and old stone, and the faint mineral sharpness of the river that ran beneath the castle's east foundation. Autumn light came through the high windows at an angle, laying pale gold bars across the flagstones. His guards stood at attention along both walls, 12 of them, their armor polished to a mirror shine for the occasion. His council occupied the raised gallery to the left. Lord Fenwick had already cleared his throat twice. Cale had not looked at him either time. He was thinking about the cold chamber, about the distance he had so carefully measured into every corner of it. He was thinking about how to be kind without being present, how to fulfill a duty without surrendering the last private territory inside himself. He had been a lord since he was 19, a political instrument since before that, and he understood the mechanics of this arrangement with the clarity of someone who had studied it from every angle. A treaty bride, a symbol, a signature made flesh. He would treat her with respect. He would ensure her comfort. He would give her children if she wished them, and space if she did not. And he would keep the cold chamber ready between them like a moat. The doors opened. She came through them alone. No attendants, no ceremonial escort. Just her, walking at a pace that was neither hurried nor performing. Simply moving, the way a person moves when they are entirely comfortable inside their own body and have never needed to perform comfort for anyone else. Cale's first impression was height. His second was color. His third was that every prepared thought he had arranged so carefully in his mind shifted. The way furniture shifts in an earthquake, still present, but no longer where he left it. She was tall. Not merely tall for a woman. Tall in the way that restructured the space around her, the way a standing stone restructures a field. Her frame was broad through the shoulder and tapered to a strong waist, and the muscle in her arms was visible even through the deep green fabric of her traveling clothes, which were practical and well made and entirely unbothered by ceremony. Her skin was the grey-green of deep river water in shadow. Not a single color, but a living one, shifting between slate and sage depending on where the autumn light touched her. Her hair was dark, pulled back with a leather cord, and her face was... He had to find the word, and the word that came was not the word he expected. Composed. Her face was composed, wide jaw, strong brow, and beneath her upper lip, the slight upward curve of tusks. Not large, not monstrous, but present and unambiguous. The color of old ivory against the grey-green of her skin. She was looking at the room, not at him. She was looking at the room the way a person looks at a place they are trying to understand. Her dark eyes moving across the stone walls, and the high windows, and the guards, and the gallery, with an attention that was methodical and entirely unafraid. Then she looked at him. Morrigan had known the hall would be cold. Stone always was. When human buildings ran to stone the way orc settlements ran to timber and packed earth. Humans liked the permanence of it, the statement it made, the way it said, "We will not be moved in a language older than words." She understood that. She had prepared herself for the cold, for the pale faces, for the particular quality of silence that filled rooms where people were watching and pretending not to. She had prepared herself for the man. She had not prepared for how young he looked, not young in years. She could see the weight of responsibility in the set of his shoulders. the careful stillness of his hands, but young in the way that people were young when they had spent a long time being exactly what was required of them, and had not yet discovered what they were when no one was requiring anything. He was lean and pale, his hair dark brown and cut close, his jaw clean-shaved. He wore his formal clothes like armor. His eyes were grey, not the warm grey of storm clouds, but the cool grey of river ice. And they were fixed on her with an expression she recognized immediately because she had seen it before, in the faces of people encountering an orc for the first time. Not fear, recalibration. She had learned to be patient with recalibration. Her tusks were her own, her skin was her own. The muscle in her arms and the breadth of her shoulders and the particular way she occupied space, all of it was hers, had always been hers, and she had spent 24 years learning to wear it without apology. Her mother had taught her that. "You are not a surprise to be apologized for," her mother had said, pressing both thumbs to Morrigan's cheekbones in the orc gesture of absolute certainty. "You are a fact. Let them adjust." She was letting him adjust. She crossed the hall at the same unhurried pace, her boots quiet on the flagstone, and she watched him watch her, and she did not look away, and she did not soften her posture to make herself smaller, and she did not smile yet, because a smile before its time was a performance, and she was not here to perform. She was here to marry this man. She was here to build something real in a place that had been prepared, she suspected, for something hollow. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to be deliberate, far enough to be respectful. He was shorter than her by perhaps 2 inches. She noticed him notice this. "Lord Thorn," she said. Her voice was low and even, there carrying the slight resonance that orc voices carried, a quality humans sometimes described as a rumble, though she thought of it simply as depth. "I am Morrigan of the Greyvale clan. I've travelled 4 days to be here." She paused. "I'd like to wash before the ceremony, if that's possible." Something moved in his face, not the recalibration. Something else, something smaller and more human. Almost, the beginning of surprise. "Of course," he said. His voice was controlled, careful. "I'll have someone show you to your rooms." "Thank you." She held his gaze for one more beat, long enough to be honest, short enough to be kind. Then she looked at the room again, at the pale gold light on the flagstones, at the high windows, at the way the stone held the cold, like a kept promise. She could smell the river beneath the floor. She could smell the beeswax and the old stone, and something else, something that was specific to this man and this room. Cedar, she thought, and something sharper beneath it. Discipline. The smell of a person who had been keeping themselves very tightly in hand for a very long time. She filed that away. A young servant appeared at her elbow, wide-eyed and trying not to show it. Morrigan smiled at her, a real smile, unhurried, showing the slight edge of her tusks, and watched the girl's expression move through surprise and land, tentatively, on something warmer. "Lead the way," Morrigan said. She followed the girl toward the side passage, and as she walked, she let her attention move through the castle the way it always did in new places, cataloguing exits, light sources, the temperature differential between the hall's center and its edges, the sound of the guards breathing as she passed. Old habit. Warrior's habit. Her clan had trained her to read a space before she trusted it, and she had never stopped. Behind her, she heard Lord Thorn say something quiet to his steward. She didn't catch the words. She caught the tone. Controlled. Careful. The voice of a man who had prepared for something, and was now, very quietly, adjusting. The cold chamber was ready. She had not seen it yet, but she already knew it was there. She could feel the shape of it in the way he held himself, in the careful distance he had placed in his eyes. Someone had prepared a space for absence, for the performance of a marriage without the substance of one. She had not come 4 days through autumn roads for absence. Morrigan followed the servant up the stone stairs, her hand trailing the wall, feeling the cold of it against her palm. the grey-green skin of her fingers against pale stone, the warmth of her own blood beneath. She was thinking about the way he had looked at her, not with cruelty, not with disgust, with recalibration, yes, but beneath that, something she had not expected to find so quickly. Attention, real attention, the kind that meant he was actually looking. She would work with that. The stairs wound upward. Somewhere above, a window let in a thread of autumn air, cold and clean, carrying the smell of turned earth and distant wood smoke. Morrigan breathed it in and felt, for the first time since crossing the border, something settle in her chest. Not comfort, exactly. Not yet. But the possibility of it. The castle smelled of tallow and old stone and something Morrigan couldn't name. A human smell, close and pale, like milk left near a fire. She had noticed it the moment they brought her through the gates. She noticed it still, standing in the corridor outside the great hall where servants moved around her like water parting for a boulder, their eyes finding the floor, their shoulders curved inward with the specific shape of people trying to take up less space near something that frightened them. She let them look. Or not look. Either was fine. Her mother had told her, humans stare or they don't, and both mean the same thing. Morrigan had been 12 when she heard that, sitting cross-legged on a training mat with blood on her knuckles and pride burning hot in her chest. She understood it better now. The servants who stared were cataloguing her, the grey-green of her forearms where her sleeves were pushed back, the slight forward jut of her lower tusks, the breadth of her shoulders against the narrow stone corridor. The ones who didn't stare had already catalogued her and decided the information was too much. She rolled her shoulders once, felt the familiar settle of muscle and bone. Fine, she'd been catalogued before. The woman who came to fetch her was small and quick-eyed, with brown hair pinned so tightly it pulled at her temples. She introduced herself as Sarah, the Lord's head of household, and she looked at Morrigan the way a person looks at a door they're not sure will fit through the frame, measuring, recalculating, privately alarmed. "My lord will receive you in the solar," Sarah said. "He asked that you—" A pause. A recalibration. "He asked that you take your time settling before the formal dinner." Morrigan looked at her steadily. "He's not ready for me yet." It wasn't a question. Sarah's mouth opened, closed. Something honest flickered across her face before she smoothed it away. "He is, preparing." "Good." Morrigan picked up the small leather bag she'd carried herself, refusing the footman who'd reached for it twice. "Show me the room." The solar was on the east side of the castle, high enough that the window looked out over the grey-brown sprawl of the outer town and, beyond it, the flat agricultural land that stretched toward the horizon like a held breath. The light coming through the glass was the thin, watery gold of late afternoon in a northern climate. Nothing like the deep amber that pawned through orc settlements at this hour. Nothing like the warmth that would have been soaking into stone walls back home, radiating back up through the soles of her feet. This light felt provisional, like it was apologizing for itself. Morrigan stood at the window and let it touch her skin anyway. Her skin was the color of deep water over moss, gray at the surface, green underneath, shifting depending on the light and her temperature, and, if she was honest, her mood, though she'd never admitted that to anyone outside her clan. In the pale northern sun, it looked darker than usual, more gray than green, and she was aware of it the way she was always aware of it in human spaces, as a fact that preceded her, as a thing that entered rooms before she did. She had not always been comfortable in her own skin. That was the truth she carried quietly. The one that didn't fit the image of the warrior bride, the political prize, the formidable orc woman who made human guards step aside. There had been years, young years, tender years, when she'd looked at her arms and seen only the ways they differed. Too broad, too dark, too much. Her grandmother had fixed that. Not with words. With hands, those enormous, scarred, beautiful orc hands that had cupped Morrigan's face and turned it toward a copper mirror and said, "Look at what was made on purpose." She touched the windowsill. The stone was cold under her fingertips. Behind her, the door opened. She knew it was him before she turned. The quality of the silence changed, became occupied, self-conscious, aware of itself. She had learned to read silences the way orc trackers read ground, by what was displaced, what was held, what was trying not to be noticed. Cale Thorne was trying not to be noticed. She turned anyway. He was not what she'd expected, and she'd expected quite a lot of things, running through possibilities the way her war captain uncle had taught her to run through tactical scenarios. She'd expected cold. She'd expected formal. She'd expected the particular blankness of a man who had decided in advance not to feel anything. All of that was there, but underneath it, visible to anyone who knew how to look, was something else entirely. He was watching her the way people watch fire, with the awareness that it could burn them and the inability to look away. Lady Morrigan. His voice was controlled. Even. The voice of a man who had practiced this sentence. Lord Thorne. She didn't move from the window. Let him have the room. Yeah, let him orient himself. It was a small courtesy, the kind her mother called giving space to the frightened animal. Not unkindly, just practically. Your castle is very cold. Something shifted in his face, not offense, surprise, like he'd prepared for a different opening move. The north is cold, he said. I can have more fires lit. I'd like that. A pause. He was tall for a human, she noted. Lean through the chest in the way of men who worked at a desk more than a training ground, though his hand suggested he hadn't always. His hair was dark, cut close at the sides, and his eyes were the color of the sky outside the window, that same thin, provisional gray. He was looking at her tusks, not rudely, with the careful attention of someone trying to understand something they'd only read about. She let him look. Both meanings. I was told, he said, and stopped. Started again. The treaty described you as a warrior. The treaty described me as an asset. She said it without heat. I am also a warrior. Those things coexist. His jaw tightened slightly, not anger, something more complicated. The expression of a man confronting the gap between what he'd been told and what was standing in front of him. I meant no. I know. She crossed the room toward him, and she watched the involuntary adjustment of his posture, the slight straightening, the almost imperceptible step back that he caught and stopped. She stopped too, leaving a careful distance between them, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough that he could breathe. You're trying to be courteous. I can see that. I'm telling you the treaty language was poor. Not that you were. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing very quiet work. You're not what I expected, he said finally. No. She held his gaze. Her tusks caught the thin gold light from the window, the lower ones smooth and pale as river stone, and she did not angle her face to minimize them the way she'd been coached to do by the treaty negotiators who thought they were helping. I rarely am. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Less defended. What did you expect? She asked. He seemed to weigh the honesty of the question against the safety of a diplomatic answer. She watched him choose. It was, she thought, the most interesting thing he'd done since entering the room. Someone quieter, he said. A sound came out of her, not quite a laugh, more the precursor to one, on low and warm in her chest. I can be quiet. I choose not to be, most of the time. Why? The question surprised her. Direct questions surprised her, coming from humans. They tended toward the oblique, the suggested, the carefully deniable. She looked at him with new attention, recalibrating. Because silence is how you disappear, she said, and I have no interest in disappearing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, no. I don't imagine you do. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was something more valuable, an observation made without judgment, without the particular flavor of human admiration that always carried a note of surprise underneath it, as though her existence required constant marveling. He said it the way you'd note a fact about the landscape. The mountain is tall, the river runs fast. She has no interest in disappearing. Morrigan felt something in her chest settle, very slightly, like a stone finding the bottom. She turned back to the window. The light was failing now, the thin gold going to pewter, the town below beginning to show its firelight in small warm squares. The temperature in the room had dropped a degree or two with the sun's retreat, and she felt it on the grey-green skin of her forearms, felt it the way orcs felt cold, as information rather than complaint. The body simply noting the world's conditions. "You said you'd have more fires lit," she said. "I will." He moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "Dinner is at the 8th bell. You don't have to attend if you'd rather rest." She glanced back at him over her shoulder. "I'll attend." "All right." "Lord Thorne," he stopped. "I know what you prepared for. I know the shape of the marriage you were expecting." She held his gaze, steady and unhurried, the way her grandmother had taught her to hold the gaze of anything that might bolt. "I'm not that." He stood very still in the doorway. The last of the afternoon light caught the side of his face and made him look, for a moment, younger than his authority. "No," he said quietly. "You're not." He left. The door closed with a soft, definitive sound. Morrigan turned back to the window and pressed her palm flat against the cold glass, feeling the temperature move through her skin and into her bones. Not unpleasant, just present, just real. Outside, the first star was appearing in the pewter sky, small and certain above the darkening land. She had not disappeared. She did not intend to start. The candles in the east corridor burned low and amber, throwing light the color of old honey across the stone floor. Morrigan walked it slowly, learning the sound of her own footsteps in this place, the particular weight of her stride against pale limestone, heavier than any human step, more deliberate. She had learned, in the first 2 days, that Kale's castle spoke in echoes. Every sound returned to you, changed slightly, like a question you hadn't meant to ask aloud. She ran one finger along the wall as she walked. The stone was cold and faintly damp, and it smelled of mineral water and old wood smoke, and beneath that something she could not name, something that was simply the smell of a human place, of human bodies, and human fires, and human years stacked one upon another, until they became architecture. Her own home had smelled of pine resin and iron, and the particular sharpness of orc tallow candles. She did not let herself miss it. Missing was a luxury, and she had not yet earned luxury here. The corridor opened into a small library, not the grand one she'd been shown on the formal tour, with its vaulted ceiling and its rows of leather spines arranged by century. This was something else. A working room, low-ceilinged, warm, smelling powerfully of beeswax and dust, and the faint sweetness of old paper. A fire burned in a grate barely large enough to be dignified. 2 chairs faced it, mismatched, clearly chosen for comfort rather than appearance. Kyle was in one of them. He hadn't heard her. His head was bent over a document, one hand pressed flat against the page, as though holding it still against some internal wind, so that the firelight found the angles of his face, the sharp jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the way his mouth moved almost imperceptibly as he read. He was dressed plainly. No ceremony in him tonight, no Lord of the Castle performance, just a man in a dark linen shirt with ink on 2 of his fingers and a candle burning down to nothing on the table beside him. Morrigan stood in the doorway and felt something shift in her chest. Not sentiment. Something more structural than that. A recognition. The way you recognize terrain you've studied on a map when you finally stand inside it. She stepped in. Her boot caught the edge of a loose flagstone, and the sound was unavoidable. He looked up. The document dropped slightly in his grip. "I didn't know anyone used this room," he said. I didn't know it existed." She moved toward the second chair, not asking permission, because asking permission to sit in a room was not something her bones understood how to do. The servant, Aldrich, mentioned it when I asked where the smaller fires were. I prefer smaller fires. Something crossed his face. Not displeasure, more like recalibration. Orc hearths, she said, because she had learned that naming the thing herself was better than watching him navigate around it. We build them low and contained. A fire that fills a room feels wasteful to us, undisciplined. She settled into the chair. It was size for a human body, which meant it was slightly too narrow across the shoulders and slightly too short in the seat, and she adjusted without comment, tucking one knee up. Your great hall fireplace is the size of a small house. It's meant to impress visiting dignitaries. It impresses me that no one has fallen into it. He made a sound. Not quite a laugh, something shorter, more surprised, like a laugh that hadn't finished deciding whether it was allowed. She filed it away. She was building a catalogue of his almost sounds, the reactions he had before he caught them and put them back behind his face. The fire popped. Outside, somewhere distant, rain had begun. She could hear it against the high window, a soft and persistent percussion, and the temperature in the room dropped 1 small degree as the draft found its way through old stone. "You were reading," she said. "Trade agreements." He set the document aside. "The Northern Passes. There's a dispute about tariff rights that predates my father's rule and will likely outlast mine. Do you want to talk about it?" He looked at her. The look lasted a beat longer than courtesy required. "No one asks me that," he said. "Whether you want to talk about your work, whether I want anything." He said it carefully, like a man testing ice. "People tell me what requires my attention. They don't generally inquire about my preferences." Morrigan considered this. She was aware of her tusks in the firelight. She was always aware of them in firelight, because firelight made them visible in a way that flat daylight didn't. The slight upward curve of them catching amber and throwing small shadows across her lower lip. Humans looked at her tusks the way they looked at weapons, with a respect that was adjacent to fear. She had grown up understanding that her face, to human eyes, read as a threat before it read as anything else. She did not hide them. She had tried, once, as a young girl, pressing her lips together to minimize the protrusion, and her grandmother had taken her by the chin and said, "Your face is not an apology, stop writing it like one." She had not tried again. "In Orc custom," she said, "when 2 people are joined, there is a period called the Vorith, the listening season. It lasts the first full turn of the moon after the joining. During that time, neither person is permitted to make decisions about the other, only to observe, only to ask." She looked at the fire. "I have been treating this as my Vorith. I realize you didn't agree to it. I don't object to it. You don't know enough about it to object or agree. Then tell me." She turned to look at him fully. He was watching her with an attention that was different from the watchfulness she'd encountered in the throne room, different from the careful, diplomatic blankness he wore in public. This was something more unguarded, a man in a small warm room with rain on the windows, genuinely asking. "The Vorith assumes," she said, "that you cannot love what you don't know, and that you cannot know what you haven't listened to. So the first moon is only listening. You learn how they sleep, how they eat, what sounds they make when they're tired, versus when they're sad. You learn the weight of them." She paused. "It sounds perhaps strange to you. It sounds like something my people forgot to invent." The fire settled. A log shifted and broke apart in a small cascade of orange. "Your tusks," he said. She went still. Not with offense, with attention, the way you go still when something important is about to happen, and you want to be fully present for it. "I've been trying not to stare," he said. "I'm aware that I haven't been entirely successful." "You haven't," she agreed. "There." He stopped, started again. "I don't have the right word. I've been looking for one for 2 days." "What words have you rejected?" he exhaled. Striking, which felt reductive. Formidable, which felt like I was describing a weapon. He looked at her directly, and there was something almost pained in it. Made the effort of a man trying to be honest past the limits of his vocabulary. They're part of your face. They're part of how you speak, how your expression moves. I keep watching them when you talk, and I think I've been afraid to say so because I didn't know if noticing was respectful or not. Morrigan was quiet for a moment. The rain intensified briefly, drumming, then softened again. In orc culture, she said, the tusks there is no direct translation. The closest would be presence marks. They indicate lineage, health, age. Mine curve outward slightly more than is typical, which my mother always said meant I would be stubborn. She touched the left one briefly with 2 fingers. An unconscious gesture, the way you touch something familiar. To notice them is not disrespectful. To pretend they aren't there would be. Then I've been doing it wrong. You've been doing it carefully. That's different. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and the firelight remapped his face in moving gold. She was aware of the size of him. Not large by orc standards, not even large by human standards, she suspected, but present. Occupying his space with a kind of quiet certainty that she hadn't expected from a man who had seemed so armored in the throne room. Can I ask you something? He said. That is not a diplomatic question. Those are the only questions I'm interested in. Are you afraid? He said it simply. Of this, of being here. The question landed in her sternum. She felt her jaw tighten briefly, the small muscular response that happened when something true was being asked of her, and she made herself not look away from it. I am orc, she said. We don't name fear easily. We were taught that naming it gives it a body. She looked at the fire, then back at him. But yes, I am afraid that you will look at me for the rest of our lives and see only the strangeness, that the Vorith will end and you will have listened and still not heard anything that matters to you. He didn't answer immediately. He sat with it, which she had not expected. Most people rush to reassure, to smooth, to make the discomfort smaller. He simply held what she'd said in the space between them and let it be the size it actually was. I hear you, he said finally, quietly, like a man who understood that those 3 words were not small. The candle beside him guttered and went out. Neither of them moved to relight it. The fire was enough, as small and contained and warm, the way she had always preferred. The beam had been there since before Kyle was born. Morrigan could tell by the way the wood had darkened, centuries of smoke and salt air pressed into its grain until it had become something closer to stone than timber. It ran the full length of the great hall's eastern wall, supporting the gallery above, and sometime in the night, she had heard it, a low groan like a creature turning in sleep. It had shifted. Now it listed at an angle that made the gallery floor above bow visibly inward, and 3 of Carl's men stood beneath it, with their arms crossed and their faces arranged into the particular expression men wore when they understood a problem completely and had absolutely no solution for it. She had come down for water. The kitchens were cold at this hour. The fire banked to coals that threw a dull amber wash across the stone floor, and the air smelled of old grease and dried herbs, and something faintly sweet she had not yet identified. Some human spice she kept meaning to ask about. Her feet were bare. She had not bothered with boots for a walk to the kitchens, and the flagstones held the deep cold of the castle's bones, which she found she did not mind. Orc blood ran warmer than human blood. Her grandmother had told her this the way she told her everything. As fact, as inheritance, as something to carry. You will never be cold the way they are cold, the old woman had said. Remember that when they try to make you small. Morrigan had not forgotten. She stood in the doorway of the great hall and looked at the beam, and looked at the men, and looked at the beam again. The gallery above held 3 tapestries she had admired 2 days ago. The colours faded, but the figures still clear, hunters and horses, and something that might have been a dragon, or might have been a very dramatic storm. She would be sorry to see them ruined. "How long has it been like this?" she asked. The three men turned. One of them, the steward, Aldrich, a narrow man with careful eyes, who had not yet decided what to make of her, cleared his throat. "Since before dawn, my lady. We've sent for the carpenter, but he's in the lower village, and the roads." He gestured vaguely at the shuttered windows, where rain had been hammering since midnight. She walked toward the beam. "My lady." Aldrich's voice carried the particular strain of a man who wanted to say stop, but had not yet determined if he was permitted to say it to her. It's not. We don't know how stable. I can see how stable it is." She could. The joint where the beam met the wall had cracked along its length. The wooden peg that had held it for a century now split and useless. The beam was heavy, old oak, dense and dark, but it had not yet fully separated from the bracket. There was still purchase, still something to work with. She pressed her palm flat against the wood. Warm faintly from whatever heat rose from the hall below. She felt the grain beneath her grey-green skin, the roughness of it, and thought of the timber yards near her mother's hold, where she had learned to read wood the way some learn it to read text. By touch, by weight, by the sound it made when you knocked against it. "There's a secondary bracket," she said, mostly to herself, "behind the plaster. You can see where the wall has a different color. There, and there," she pointed. "If someone braces the beam from below, while someone else drives a new peg into the original joint, it will hold until your carpenter arrives." Silence. She turned. The three men were looking at her with an expression she recognized. Not hostility, not quite, but the particular blankness that preceded a recalibration. She had seen it before. She would see it again. The moment when a person realized that what they had assumed about her and what she actually was were two different countries. "The brace would need to hold significant weight," Aldrich said carefully. "Yes." She turned back to the beam. "It would." She heard him understand. She heard it in the small sound he made, not quite a word. And in the shuffle of feet, as the other two men exchanged a glance, she didn't need to see to know the shape of. Morrigan set her feet. The flagstones were cold against her bare soles, and she felt the chill travel up through her ankles, her calves, grounding her. She was taller than all three of them by nearly a hand's span. Her shoulders, beneath the loose linen of her sleeping shirt, were built from years of training that had never been about beauty and had always been about survival, about being useful, about being capable, about being the kind of person her people could rely on when the situation stopped being theoretical. She lifted the beam. Not easily. She would not pretend it was easy, and she had no patience for the kind of performance that made strength look effortless when it was not. Her muscles engaged in sequence. Her jaw tightened, and she felt the familiar burn across her upper back that meant she was working at the edge of her capacity. The beam was perhaps 400 pounds of ancient oak. She had moved heavier things. She had moved heavier things in worse conditions, in rain and mud, with people depending on the outcome. "Now," she said through her teeth, "the peg. Someone needs to drive a new peg into the joint while I hold it in position." For a moment nobody moved. Then Aldrich moved. He grabbed a mallet from the tool bag one of the other men had brought, found a wooden peg of roughly the right diameter, and climbed the short ladder to the bracket, with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided that the situation was simply what it was, and that he would deal with his feelings about it later. She respected that. She respected it enormously. The mallet struck 3 times. 4. She held the beam steady and breathed through it, slow and deliberate, the way her mother had taught her to breathe through pain and effort, not suppressing it, but moving through it like water through stone. Her tusks were clenched together. She was aware of them the way she was always aware of them in human spaces. The slight self-consciousness that she had never entirely shed. The old reflex to wonder how she looked to them. Monstrous, perhaps. Useful, perhaps. She had learned that both could be true at once, and that neither was the whole of her. "Done," Aldrich said. She lowered the beam with the same care she had lifted it, set it back into the bracket, stepped back and pressed her palms against her thighs and breathed. The hall was quiet except for the rain. That will hold," she said. "Tell your carpenter to replace the peg with iron when he comes. The wood has been compromised." She was halfway back to the kitchen doorway when she heard him. Kyle stood at the far end of the hall in a dark robe, his hair disordered from sleep, a candle in one hand that threw his face into sharp relief. The strong line of his jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes that she had noticed were always there, as though he carried his exhaustion, like a second self. He was looking at her. He had been there long enough to have seen at least some of it, she thought. His expression was not the blankness of recalibration. It was something else. Something she did not yet have a name for in the human vocabulary she was still learning. She met his eyes, did not look away. She had learned very young that looking away first was a language, and she was careful about what she said with her body. "The beam shifted," she said. "It's stable now." I heard. His voice was low, roughened by sleep. He looked at the beam, looked at her. "Are you—" He stopped, started again. "You're not hurt." It was not quite a question. "No." She flexed her fingers, feeling the faint ache in her palms where the wood had bitten. "I'm not fragile." Something moved across his face. Quick, like light moving across water when a cloud passes. She watched it and could not entirely read it, and she found that she wanted to. That she was genuinely and specifically curious about the interior of this man who had prepared himself so thoroughly for a marriage he had not wanted, and who now stood in his own great hall at 3 a.m, looking at her as though she had rearranged something in him that he had believed was fixed. "No," he said quietly. "You're not." The candle flame bent in a draft from somewhere. The amber light caught the grey-green of her forearms, the faint silver undertone her skin carried in low light, and she watched him notice it. Not with revulsion, not with the careful, studied neutrality some of his court managed, but with something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like attention, like genuine attention. "Go back to sleep," she said, not unkindly. "The carpenter will come tomorrow and make it proper." She went to the kitchen, found her water, stood for a moment in the cold red dark, and listened to the rain, and felt the ache in her back, and her shoulders and her hands, and felt beneath that something quieter. Something she was not ready to name yet, but that sat in her chest like an ember. Small, specific, and warm. She was not cold the way they were cold. She was beginning to think that might matter more than she had allowed herself to hope. The great hall smelled of tallow candles, and old stone and something underneath both. The particular coal dust scent of a room that had forgotten what celebration felt like. Morrigan noticed it the moment she crossed the threshold. Her people's longhouses always smelled of pine resin and rendered fat and the living warmth of bodies pressed close in winter. This room smelled like a record kept in a drawer. She stood at the long table's edge and surveyed it. Kyle sat at the head, already in position, already arranged. His posture was the posture of a man who had learned early that rooms were things to be managed. The candlelight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the careful stillness of his hands flat against the table. Pale hands. She had noticed them before. The way they moved with such deliberate economy, as though every gesture had been audited for necessity before being permitted. Her own hands were resting at her sides, grey-green and broad-knuckled, the kind of hands her mother had called working hands, which in Orcish meant something closer to honest hands, which meant something closer still to hands that do not apologize for what they are. She sat. The servants moved around them both with the practiced silence of people trained to be invisible, and Morrigan watched them the way she always watched them, not as furniture, but as the actual architecture of this place. Dina, the youngest, was carrying a soup tureen that was clearly too heavy for her, the tendons in her thin wrists straining white. Morrigan tracked this without comment. She was learning when to offer help, and when offering help was its own kind of insult in this culture. The line was finer than she'd expected. Carl said, "The northern delegation confirmed their departure for morning." "Good." She reached for the bread before the servant could offer it, tore a piece with her fingers. They kept looking at my tusks when they thought I wasn't watching. A pause, small and precise. I noticed, he said. She glanced at him. Something in the admission surprised her. Not the noticing, but the telling. Carl rarely offered information that wasn't requested. She filed it away the way she filed most things about him. Carefully, without pressure, in the part of her mind that was still learning his particular language. Does it bother you? She asked. When they do that? He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. The candlelight moved across his face in slow amber waves, and outside the narrow windows the evening had gone the color of a bruise. Deep violet at the edges, fading to grey at the center, the last of the sun gone somewhere west without ceremony. It bothers me, he said finally, that they think I don't notice. Morrigan looked at him for a moment. Then something shifted in her chest. A loosening, small and sudden, and she laughed. Not a polite sound. Not the careful, contained expression she had been practicing since her arrival. The one that didn't show too much tusk, didn't carry too far down the corridor, didn't startle the servants or unsettle the guards. This was the laugh she'd grown up with, the one that came from the belly and meant what it said. It rang off the stone ceiling and the cold walls, and came back to her changed, warmer somehow, as though the room had held it and returned it with interest. Kyle stared at her. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, not in apology, but in surprise at herself. Forgive me. I didn't mean to. Don't. His voice was quiet, not commanding, something else. Don't apologize for it. She lowered her hand slowly. He was still looking at her with that expression she had not yet catalogued. Not discomfort, not the careful blankness he deployed in public, but something that lived closer to the surface than she'd seen from him before. His brow had done something complicated. His mouth was not quite closed. It's a remarkable sound, he said. And then, as though the admission had cost him something, and he needed to account for the expenditure, I don't think these walls have heard anything like it. Morrigan felt the warmth move through her the way warmth moved through her people. Not delicately, not in the human fashion of a flush at the cheek, but as a full-body thing, a tide that started somewhere below the sternum and moved outward. Her skin, grey-green in the candlelight, held heat differently than human skin. She knew this. She had always run warmer than the people in this castle, had woken each morning to find the blankets thrown back, the cold air a relief rather than a punishment. She reached for her wine. In my mother's hall, she said, silence at the table was considered rude. It meant you had nothing to offer. Here it means you're being respectful. I know. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. I've been very respectful. Something moved across his face, fast. Gone before she could name it, but she had seen it. She was certain she had seen it. And it looked, improbably, like the beginning of a smile. You have, he agreed. It's been unsettling. She set the cup down. Unsettling. I prepared for... He stopped. Started again with the precision of a man choosing words the way a surgeon chose instruments. I had certain expectations about what this arrangement would be. You have not met any of them. Is that a complaint? No. The word came without hesitation, and that was its own kind of information. It is not a complaint. The soup arrived. Dina said it before Morrigan with both hands, the way she'd learned Morrigan preferred. Not because Morrigan had asked, but because Morrigan had thanked her so specifically the first time that the girl had clearly decided to repeat the action indefinitely. Morrigan caught her eye and nodded once, and Dina's face did the small private thing it always did, the thing that looked like being seen. Kyle watched this exchange. He watched it the way he watched most things she did, with a quality of attention that felt different from observation. More like study, more like a man revising something he had written. Tell me about your mother's hall, he said. She looked up. Why? Because you mentioned it. A pause. Because you mention it the way people mention places they miss. Morrigan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had found a gap somewhere in the old stone, and was making a low sound through it. Not quite a whistle, more like a held breath. The candles nearest the window bent slightly and recovered. "It was loud," she said. "Always. Someone arguing, someone laughing, someone sharpening something that didn't need sharpening just to have something to do with their hands." She turned the soup spoon over once. "My mother presided over all of it like she'd personally arranged the chaos and was proud of the result. She sounds formidable. She would have terrified you." Morrigan said it without cruelty, simply as fact. "She terrified everyone. She was twice my size and half my patience, and she laughed exactly the way I just laughed, which she said meant we were the same kind of trouble." Kyle was quiet, but it was a different quality of quiet than his usual. Not the managed silence of a man maintaining distance, but the quiet of someone listening with their whole attention, the way you listen to something you didn't want to end. "You miss her," he said. "Every day." She said it plainly, the way her people said true things, without softening, because softening implied the truth needed protection. She died 2 winters before the treaty. She would have had opinions about all of this. About the marriage. About you. Morrigan met his eyes directly. His were dark in the candlelight, the color of deep water, and they were doing the complicated thing again. The thing she was beginning to suspect was what Cale Thorne looked like when he forgot to manage himself. "She would have watched you for one meal and told me exactly what you needed and exactly what you were afraid of, and she would have been right, and it would have been infuriating." The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture and weight and warmth, the way silences did when 2 people were occupying the same moment without defense. "What would she have said?" he asked, quietly, as though he actually wanted to know. Morrigan considered him, the careful hands now slightly less careful, with one of them resting near his wine cup with the fingers loosely curled, the jaw still sharp but the set of it different, the held tension fractionally released. The man beneath the arrangement of him, visible in small increments, like something surfacing slowly from deep water. "She would have said," Morrigan told him, "that you have been alone for so long that you've mistaken it for preference." He did not answer immediately. The candle between them guttered once and steadied. "She would have been right," he said. Low, careful, the most unguarded thing she had heard from him. Morrigan did not push. Her people knew the value of leaving space around a truth, the way you left space around a fire so it could breathe and grow, rather than smothering it with your need for warmth. She picked up her spoon. She returned to the soup. She let the moment be what it was. But when she glanced up again, some minutes later, Kyle was still watching her with that expression she had not yet named, and she thought, with the particular certainty, of a woman who had grown up reading weather and warriors and the moods of difficult terrain, that she was getting closer to naming it. The hall still smelled of tallow and old stone, but underneath, very faintly, something else, something that had not been there before. Not pine resin, not rendered fat, not the warmth of bodies pressed close in winter. Something newer, something beginning. The library smelled of beeswax and old leather, and something beneath both, a mineral dryness, like stone that had never known rain. Morrigan stood at the window with her palms pressed flat against the sill, feeling the cold seep up through her grey-green skin, and thought about home. Not with longing. That surprised her still, 5 weeks into this marriage, that the thought of home arrived without the sharp pull she'd expected. More like touching a scar. Familiar. No longer raw. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling. She watched it come down in the pale afternoon light. That particular quality of winter illumination that flattened everything to silver and ash. The courtyard below had emptied. Servants moved in quick, hunched shapes along the covered walkways, breath clouding white, and Morrigan found herself cataloguing the differences again. The way humans contracted in cold, folding inward, making themselves small. Her own body ran warmer than theirs. She'd known this in the abstract, or the way one knows a fact read from a page, but living inside it was different. She stood at an open window in a thin linen shirt and felt only pleasantly cool. And somewhere behind her, Carl had added a third log to the fire. She heard him now. The soft displacement of air as he moved between the shelves. The particular rhythm of his footsteps, unhurried but never quite at rest. "You're letting the cold in," he said. "I know." She didn't turn. "I like it." A pause. Then the sound of a book being set down, carefully, the way he did everything. "I've noticed," Carl said, and there was something in his voice she'd been learning to read. Not quite warmth, not yet, but the place warmth lived before it had permission to show itself. "You open windows that everyone else closes." Morrigan turned then, and the firelight caught her tusks as she moved, the smooth curve of them catching amber and throwing it back in a brief pale gleam. She'd stopped being self-conscious about that particular thing somewhere around the third week. Or rather, she'd stopped performing the self-consciousness she thought was expected of her. There was a difference. Carl was standing between two shelves, a book still in one hand, watching her with that careful attention he'd never quite learned to disguise. "In Orc halls," she said, "we build the fires in the center of the room, open to the ceiling. The smoke goes up and the heat spreads out and everyone sits around it together." She looked at the fireplace, its tidy stone frame, its iron grate, its deliberate containment. Here the fire is against the wall, behind a barrier, but the heat goes mostly up the chimney. He considered this. Carl Thorne considered things the way other men breathed, automatically, continuously, as though thinking were the fundamental condition of his existence, rather than an activity he chose. "Less efficient," he said, "much less." She crossed to the chair nearest the fire, not because she needed the warmth, but because it was the chair closest to him, and she'd decided some weeks ago to stop pretending that wasn't why she chose it. "But it looks contained, controlled. I think that matters more to your people than the heat itself." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense. She'd learned the difference between his offended face and his thinking face, and this was the latter, sharper at the eyes, the line of his jaw going still. "That's probably true," he said, and sat down across from her. The fire crackled between them. Outside, snow fell in the silver light. This was the thing she hadn't expected. Not the cold chamber he'd prepared, not the political distance, not even his initial careful blankness when she'd arrived. She hadn't expected the conversations, the way he listened, genuinely, as though what she said rearranged something inside him that he then had to quietly put back in order. No one had warned her that the hardest part of being other wouldn't be the staring, or the instinctive way his guards had stepped back when she'd first walked through the gate, or the servant girl who dropped an entire tray of silver upon seeing her tusks up close. The hardest part was this, being seen clearly, and not knowing yet whether clearly meant completely. "Can I ask you something?" she said. You always do? And you always answer." She let that sit for a moment, because it was true, and she wanted him to hear it as the thing it was, not an observation, but a form of gratitude. "When I first arrived, the cold chamber, the separate arrangements." She watched his hands, which had gone still on the arms of the chair. His hands were expressive in the way his face was not, and she'd learned to read them. "Was that because of the politics? Or because of what I am?" The fire popped. A log shifted. Carl was quiet for long enough that a lesser version of her, the version that had existed before 5 weeks of this particular marriage, might have taken the silence for an answer and looked away. She held his gaze instead. Her orc blood ran patient in ways that sometimes startled her, a deep cultural stillness that her mother had called the warrior's first gift, the ability to wait without flinching. "Both," he said finally, "and neither, entirely." He set the book down on the table beside him. "I'd prepared for a transaction. I told myself it was wisdom, that expecting nothing was the same as being protected. His eyes moved to the fire, then back to her. I didn't prepare for you specifically. I prepared for an absence. Morrigan felt that land somewhere below her sternum. Not painfully. More like pressure, the kind that meant something real was being pressed against something real. And now? She asked. Now, Carl said, I find I've been dismantling the preparations. She wanted to smile and didn't, because this felt too careful for smiling, too new. Instead, she reached across the small table between their chairs and picked up the book he'd set down, turned it in her hands, her grey-green fingers broad against the pale cover. The contrast she'd stopped trying not to notice, because noticing it had become, quietly, one of her private pleasures. The way her skin looked in firelight, the way it looked against the white stone of his castle walls, against the pale linen of the bed they'd begun, tentatively, to share. She was not invisible here. She was not camouflaged or assimilated. She was entirely, visibly herself, and something about that, about the impossibility of disappearing, had begun to feel less like exposure and more like a kind of freedom. In my culture, she said, turning the book's pages without reading them, otherness is a position of power. The one who is different sees everything the ones who belong cannot see. She set the book down. I've been watching your castle see itself through my eyes. It's strange and useful. What do you see? He leaned forward slightly, just slightly. A people who've built very beautiful cages, she said, and called them rooms. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had texture, the soft percussion of snow against glass, the fire's low conversation with itself, the smell of beeswax and old leather, and beneath it, the particular scent she'd come to associate with Cale himself. Something like cedar and cold ink, clean and specific. And the library? He asked. Is this a cage? She looked around, at the shelves climbing to the ceiling, the ladders on their brass rails, and the thousands of spines in brown and burgundy and faded gold, the window where snow fell in the silver light. Her tusks caught the firelight again as she turned her head, and she didn't look away from him when they did. No, she said. This one feels like something else. What? She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to think in this marriage, without performing certainty she didn't have. Her broad hands rested on her knees, her posture easy, the warmth of her orc blood making the cold room irrelevant to her body even as it registered, pleasantly, against her skin. It feels like the place you actually live, she said, not the place you perform living. Carl looked at her for a long moment. His face did the thing it sometimes did, the careful blankness giving way to something underneath, in brief as a window opening and closing, but she'd learned to catch it. Yes, he said quietly. That's right. Outside, the snow was thickening. The silver light was going grey, the afternoon folding toward evening, and the fire had burned down to a deep amber that made the whole room feel smaller and warmer and more real. Morrigan was aware of her own body in the specific way she often was in his presence. The solidity of herself, the particular weight of her frame in the chair, the warmth that lived in her skin without requiring the fire's permission. She was not diminished here, not reduced, not a treaty clause or a conquered thing or a creature to be managed. She was a woman in a library, in a marriage that was becoming something neither of them had prepared for. And the otherness she'd carried her whole life like armor was becoming slowly something else. Not a wall, a door. Kyle reached across the table, unhurried, deliberate, the way he did everything, and turned the book back toward himself. His fingers brushed hers in the process. Neither of them moved away. Stay, he said. I'll read to you if you like. There's one here about orc architectural traditions. I found it last week. Morrigan looked at him. The fire, the snow. You found it last week, she said slowly, and you've been waiting. He didn't answer, but his hands resting on the book were perfectly still. She settled deeper into the chair and let the warmth of the room, the fire's warmth, the cedar and ink warmth, the warmth of being seen, settle around her like something she might, eventually, call home. And the candle had burned to a stub. Morrigan watched the flame shiver in the draught that crept beneath the chamber door, a thin, cold tongue of air that smelled of stone and old winter. The light it threw was amber dark, the color of resin, the color of something preserved. It pooled on the floor in a small, trembling circle, and did not reach the corners of the room, where the shadows had settled in like permanent guests. She sat on the edge of the bed. Their bed now, though the word still felt like a garment she hadn't yet broken in, and pressed the heels of her palms against her knees. Her tusks ached. It was a thing she had never told anyone. In cold weather, in the deep cold that this human castle seemed to breathe out from its very walls, the roots of her tusks ached where they met her jaw, in a low persistent throb that her mother had called the winter bone. Every orc knew it. No one spoke of it. To speak of it was to admit that the body had limits, and the body was not supposed to have limits. The body was the first armor. The body was the argument you made before you opened your mouth. She pressed her tongue briefly against the inner curve of her left tusk. The ache pulsed once, dull and intimate. Kyle was not in the room. He had left an hour ago. She'd heard the door, heard his footsteps in the corridor, measured and deliberate as always, the walk of a man who had decided where he was going before he stood up. She had not called after him. She had sat here instead, in the amber dark, listening to the castle settle around her, its old bones groaning in the frost. She was tired in a way that sleep would not fix. Not the tiredness of the body. Her body was fine, was always fine, was built for endurance in ways that still made the human servants blink when they thought she wasn't watching. She had carried a supply chest up 3 flights of stairs last week because a young footman had struggled with it, and the ease with which she'd done it had silenced the entire hallway. She had not meant to silence anyone. She had only meant to help. But her strength read differently here. It read as spectacle. It read as warning. She was tired of being read wrong. The door opened. Cal came in quietly, the way he'd learned to do. Not because she startled easily, but because he'd noticed somewhere in the past weeks that she valued the small courtesy of announced presence. He carried 2 cups. Steam rose from them in pale threads that dissolved before they reached the ceiling. He smelled of the cold corridor and something underneath it. Wood smoke and the particular soap he used. Plain and unscented by human standards, but distinct to her, as recognizable now as her own name. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You didn't sleep," he said. "No." He crossed the room and held out one of the cups. She took it. The ceramic was warm against her grey-green palms, and she wrapped both hands around it and let the heat move into her fingers, into the joints that had stiffened without her noticing. He sat beside her on the bed. Not at a careful distance. Beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The candle flame steadied, then shivered again. Outside, the wind moved against the shutters in a long, low sound like something trying to find a way in. "I heard you," he said finally, "earlier, through the door." She went still. I didn't mean to listen. I was coming back and I heard you, and I stopped." He turned the cup in his hands. "You were speaking in your language. Orcish. I don't know what you were saying." She knew what she had been saying. She had been speaking the grief words, the low, repetitive phrases her grandmother had taught her for the moments when the feeling was too large for silence, but too private for anyone else. The words that meant something between "I am still here" and "I am not sure I should be." There was no human equivalent. She had checked. "It is a..." She stopped, started again. "It is something we do when we are far from home. A way of reminding the self that the self is still intact." He was quiet for a long moment. "Are you still intact?" The question landed somewhere she had not expected. She felt it in her chest, in the place beneath her sternum where orc healers said the second heart lived. Not a physical organ, but the seat of the things you carried. She had not been asked that question since she left. Not by anyone. I don't know, she said. It was the truest thing she had said in weeks. Carl set his cup down on the floor beside his boot. He turned toward her, and she could see the effort in it. Not physical effort, but the other kind. The kind that cost something. His face in the amber light was open in a way she had not seen before. The careful architecture of it. The composed distance he wore like formal clothing. He had come apart somewhere in the corridor, somewhere between the door and this moment. And what was underneath was younger and less certain and entirely real. I prepared for this marriage, he said, by preparing to feel nothing. She waited. I told myself it was practical, mature, that love was a luxury that political arrangements couldn't afford. He exhaled slowly. I told myself that so many times I almost believed it. And now? Now I think I was terrified. The words came out flat and plain, stripped of performance. Not of you. Not of what you are. Of wanting something and losing it. Of letting something matter. The candle threw his shadow long against the wall. She studied the line of his jaw, the particular tension in his hands where they rested on his knees. She had learned to read him the way she'd learned to read terrain, patiently, with full attention, trusting what the small signs said over what the surface showed. Kyle. He looked at her. I was afraid too. She held his gaze. I am afraid. Every morning I wake in this room and I think, today will be the day he looks at me and sees only the tusks, only the skin, only the thing that does not belong here. Her thumb moved along the curve of the cup. I have been waiting for you to flinch. I haven't. No, she said. You haven't. The silence between them changed. It was not the silence of distance. It was the other kind, the kind that forms when two people have said the real thing and are sitting inside it together, letting it be real. He reached out. Slowly, with the deliberateness she'd come to understand was not hesitation, but intention. He placed his hand over hers where it held the cup. His fingers were pale against her grey-green knuckles. Human pale, thin-boned, the hand of a man built for different work than she was. She felt the warmth of it move through her skin and into the ache beneath. I see you, he said. I want you to know that. Not in spite of what you are. Because of it. All of it. She felt something shift in the architecture of her chest. Not breaking. The opposite of breaking. The way a door opens that has been shut for a very long time. The wood swelling back into its frame. The fit becoming right. In my culture, she said quietly, there is a word. Vorak. It means... She searched for the shape of it in his language. It means the person who sees your strength and does not look away from your wound. Both at once. It is the highest thing you can call someone. He was very still. It is not a word we use lightly. Morrigan. Her name in his mouth, low and careful. I am not saying it yet, she said, and she felt the corner of her mouth lift, the small involuntary warmth of it. I am saying you are becoming someone I might say it to. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, not the polished social sound she'd heard from him in formal rooms, but something rougher and more honest, something that came from the same place as the open face and the admission in the dark. His hand tightened briefly over hers. Outside, the wind had quieted. The cold still pressed against the shutters, patient and impersonal. But inside the amber circle of the dying candle, the air held a different temperature entirely. Not warm in the way of fires or blankets, but warm in the way of proximity, of two bodies close enough that the heat they generated became a shared thing. She set the cup down. He did not move his hand. The candle guttered, held. The flame thinned to a thread of orange light and then steadied again, burning lower now, burning toward its end, but burning still, small and persistent and entirely unwilling to go out. She turned her hand beneath his so that their palms met, her grey-green skin against his pale human warmth. The fit of it was not seamless. Their hands were different in every measurable way, different in size and color and the particular geography of callus and bone. But they held. They held without effort, without negotiation, without either of them deciding to hold. Some things, she thought, did not need to be decided. Some things simply became true. She leaned her shoulder against his. He did not move away. The shadows in the corners of the room stayed where they were, dark and patient, but they did not feel like permanent guests anymore. They felt like what they were, just the absence of light, ordinary and temporary, waiting for morning the way everything waited for morning. The candle burned. They sat inside its warmth. The morning came in through the eastern window like something that had finally decided to stay. Not the sharp, interrogating light of winter. This was softer, amber pale, the color of old honey, pooling across the stone floor in slow widening shapes that reached toward the bed as if curious. Morrigan watched it move. She had been awake long enough to see it travel from the far wall to the edge of the wool blanket, and she had not moved, because moving would end this, and she was not ready for this to end. Kyle slept beside her. His breathing was the quietest sound she had ever learned to love. Slow, even. The exhale slightly longer than the inhale, a rhythm she now knew the way she knew her own pulse. She had catalogued it without meaning to, the way her people catalogued terrain, not for conquest, but for survival, for knowing where you stood, for knowing whether the ground beneath you was solid. This ground was solid. She turned her head and looked at him. The amber light had reached his shoulder, and it made his skin look less pale than usual, warmer, almost golden, the way firelight had always been more honest about him than daylight. His face in sleep lost the careful architecture he maintained while waking. The controlled jaw, the measured eyes, all of it released, and what remained was simply a man, and she loved him so completely that the feeling had no edges she could find. Her hand rested on her own sternum. She could feel her heartbeat there, steady, unhurried, nothing like the clenched, embracing thing it had been the morning she arrived at this castle. That morning felt like a different life. It felt like a story told about someone else, a young orc woman standing in a courtyard, with her spine locked straight and her tusks catching the grey autumn light, telling herself that duty was enough. That duty was everything. That wanting more than duty was a kind of weakness her people could not afford. She'd been wrong about that. She had been wrong about several things. The blanket shifted. Kyle exhaled differently, the small change in rhythm that meant waking, and Morrigan did not pretend she had been sleeping. She was an orc. She did not pretend. "You've been watching me." His voice was rough with sleep, and he did not open his eyes yet. "Studying," she said. "There is a difference." One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the precursor to one, the thing that happened in him before he allowed himself the full expression. And she had learned that too, had memorized the whole quiet vocabulary of him the way she had once memorized the war songs of her grandmother's clan, word by careful word, until they lived inside her. He opened his eyes. The light caught them, grey, like riverstones after rain, and like the underside of clouds that carry water but have not yet released it. And he looked at her the way he had been looking at her for months now, with something that still seemed to surprise him, as if he kept expecting the feeling to have diminished overnight and kept finding it hadn't. "What were you studying?" he asked. "Your breathing." She said it plainly. The way it changes when you move from deep sleep to shallow. You spend approximately 4 minutes in the shallow before you wake. I have timed it. He turned onto his side to face her fully. That is either very romantic or very alarming. "Among my people," she said, "knowing someone's rhythms is how you show you have paid attention. It is the highest form of respect." She paused. Her tusk caught the light as she tilted her head. She felt it, the familiar weight of it, yet the slight asymmetry of her own face that she had spent years learning not to apologize for. You may decide which category it falls into. Romantic, he said without hesitation. Definitively. She felt the warmth of that move through her chest, like something poured slowly from a great height. He reached up and touched her jaw. His fingers were careful. Not the carefulness of a man handling something fragile, but the carefulness of a man handling something he valued, which was different, which was everything. His thumb traced the line where her grey-green skin met the base of her tusk, and he did it the way he always did, with a kind of quiet attention that said, "I see this. I am not looking past it. I am looking at it. I've been thinking," he said. "Dangerous habit. Morrigan, Kyle." He held her gaze, outside, and her bird began somewhere in the courtyard garden. A single clear note, then a phrase, then the full song opening up like a door. The amber light had reached the bed now, lying across the blanket in a warm stripe between them. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything practical or taxonomically accurate about Orc customs." She pressed her lips together, waited. "I prepared for a marriage that would cost me something." His voice was low, deliberate, each word placed with the care of a man who had spent most of his life keeping words locked behind his teeth. "I prepared to give up the idea of this, of being known, of someone looking at me the way you look at me, like I am worth the looking." He exhaled. "I told myself that was fine. That it was enough to do my duty and maintain my dignity and not want things I couldn't have." The bird outside continued. A second voice joined it, lower, answering. "You made me want things," Carl said. "You walked into my throne room, and you were so entirely yourself, and I didn't know what to do with that. I had no preparation for someone who simply was, without apology, without performance. You laughed in my great hall, and it echoed off the stone, and I stood there thinking I had made a catastrophic miscalculation." "You thought I was a problem," she said. "I thought you were going to ruin me." He said it without drama, just fact. I was right. Morrigan was quiet for a moment. The light was full across the bed now, and she could feel it on her skin. That particular warmth of morning sun that her grandmother had called the first gift, the one the world gave before it asked anything of you. She had not thought of her grandmother in weeks. She thought of her now with a fullness in her chest that was not grief but something adjacent to it, something that honored the distance she had traveled. She had been afraid too. She could say that now. She had stood in that courtyard with her spine locked straight and her face arranged into the mask her clan mother had taught her. Dignity, always dignity. Let them see your strength before they see anything else. And beneath it, she had been terrified. Not of him, and of the possibility that she would spend the rest of her life in a place where no one would ever look past the tusks and the grey-green skin and the breadth of her shoulders to find the woman underneath. That she would be tolerated, accommodated, never truly seen. She reached up and covered his hand with hers, where it still rested against her jaw. Her hand was larger than his. It always would be. The green-grey of her knuckles against the pale of his wrist was a contrast she had stopped trying to minimize and started simply inhabiting. The way you inhabit any truth that turns out to be livable. "I was afraid," she said, "that you would look at me and see a treaty. I know. That I would be something you endured. I know." His fingers pressed gently. "I'm sorry for every day I made you feel that." "You stopped," she said. "That is what matters in my culture, not the falling short, the turning back." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning had fully arrived now, unhurried and complete, filling the room with its amber gold and the sound of birds and the faint smell of bread beginning somewhere below in the kitchens. Yeast and warmth rising through the castle's old stones. She breathed it in. She had learned to love the smell of this place. She had learned to love the cold of the stone floors under her bare feet in the early hours, the particular creak of the third stair, the way the great hall sounded when it was empty, and her footsteps were the only thing in it. She had learned to love him, not despite the difficulty of it, not around it. Through it, the way water moves through stone. Not by force, but by patience, by the willingness to keep returning. Stay, Kyle said. It was not a question. It was not a command. It was the word stripped down to its simplest form, offered without armor. Morrigan looked at him, at the careful, complicated, slowly opening man she had somehow been given, this human with his grey eyes and his measured words and his 4 minutes of shallow sleep before waking. And she felt something settle in her the way the great stones of her grandmother's hall had settled, deep and final and load-bearing. I was never leaving, she said. He pulled her closer. She let herself be pulled, which was its own kind of strength. The orc understanding of it, the one her clan mother had never quite taught her, but that she had found here, in this bed, in this amber morning, that choosing to yield to something good is not weakness, and it is the bravest thing a warrior can do. Outside, the birds sang, the bread rose, the light held. She closed her eyes and felt his heart beat under her palm, steady, unhurried, learning her rhythm the way she had learned his, and she thought, this is what a lifetime feels like when it is warm. She did not need to say it aloud. He already knew.